First, though, in the weeks since the shooting death of a man in North Minneapolis named Jamar Clark, a shooting that led to weeks of protests at the 4th Precinct Police Station, we've heard from several people on this show from the group Black Lives Matter Minneapolis and the Minneapolis NAACP. Last week, Police Chief Janae Harto also appeared on the show, and today I'm joined by the head of the Minneapolis Police Union, Bob Kroll. Bob, welcome to the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
When police shoot someone, anywhere in the country, when this happens, where there's an officer that shoots someone, there are a lot of officials who can and won't comment while the investigation's going on. And that often leaves us, the public, with witness accounts and people like you speaking on behalf of the police. What is your role, frankly, in a world where people are skeptical of both? What is your role, do you think, in the dissemination of information?
Well, I think all the evidence needs to be withheld until the investigation is complete. Actual physical evidence, video evidence, all that stuff needs to be kept out of the public view to maintain its integrity. However, that doesn't prevent police leaders, be it the chief, the union president, to come out and make a strong statement. If they believe the officers acted lawful and proper, to come out and make that statement. And until many chiefs across the nation, until their officers are proven otherwise, they come out with a statement like that. In that case, it didn't happen, and that's why I did that for the officers.
So you're saying we should keep the evidence sequestered until the investigation, but it's okay to say, here's what I think. Here's why I think the police officers are okay in this situation, that it was justifiable.
Correct. On a preliminary review, I think good police leaders have enough to go on to come out and make a statement that they're standing by their officers and just let the investigation proceed. Doesn't have to be a lot of specifics, but if they need to also discredit some falsehoods that are out there. One of the things that came out was he was handcuffed and then he was shot and then he was unhandcuffed. In this age, with everybody having a cell phone, iPhone, video cameras, if that occurred, that video evidence would have surfaced somewhere already, and that hasn't. And I don't think you're going to see that surface.
Have you seen any video?
No, I've not.
Then why should we trust you, frankly, Bob? If you weren't there, right? If you weren't in the moment, what good is your word in this case?
The only information I put out was what I was told by the attorney that represented the officers in their statements. Mm-hmm. So I summarized what was given and provided in their statements, and that's not going to change. So I'm backing the officers. I believe that they were truthful in their statements, and at the end of this, there will be a no bill.
We also have heard in our reporting, talking to people, witnesses, there's a stark difference between the witness accounts that we've heard from in some cases and the scene that you described through the attorney, as you noted, the statement you gave through the spokesman. I have one witness here in one of our stories. Tito Wilson saw the shooting from across the street. They had the guy pinned down on the ground. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't kicking. He was perfectly still laying on the ground. Two others in that story talking about a subdued Jamar Clark. Now, we don't have to get into the specifics of that, but my point in bringing that up is that eyewitness reports in academia have been studied and found to be very, in many cases, unreliable. But frankly, that's on both sides. So that's on the side of the police officers' eyewitness accounts too. So why aren't we just saying nothing? Why are you going off one set of eyewitness accounts and defending the officers when we know this kind of larger study of eyewitness accounts and their reliability?
Well, I think it's in the best interest of the officers involved. Having been involved in shootings myself before, the officers, they didn't ask for that situation. They responded to that situation. And a lot of it were the talk prior, though the police are targeting people. They didn't just come upon Jamar Clark. And we know some things about Jamar Clark. His history was a very violent history. He's, by all rights, he should have been incarcerated during that incident. And if, judges would have held that, he would have never been on the street. That's been proven. And the officers did not ask for that situation. Jamar Clark's noncompliance created that situation. And that's what gets lost in the shuffle.
And noncompliance, and you state the history there, a criminal history, none of which the protesters say is grounds for that man to have been shot in that moment.
Well, one thing we know, Tom, is in that situation, had he not assaulted the female there, had she not been in the ambulance being treated, had she not tried to get into the ambulance, or he tried to get into the ambulance at her again, and the design of the ambulance now, the paramedics don't have the ability to go from the back to the front and drive off. The old ambulances, they would have been accessible, and they could have just drove out of the scene with her in the back. They were trapped in the back compartment, and that's when the paramedics had called for help. And those two officers, it could have been any two other officers that responded to the scene. Now, Jamar Clark dictated the circumstances with that. If he would have complied with verbal commands, there would have been no force used, but he chose not to do that. So the officers had to go hands-on, and that's when the struggle ensued. You're never going to find anybody completely compliant with police and getting shot.
This is when you say what you just said, it's interesting to me because I don't know that maybe it's a little more gray area for me, because on the one hand, you're saying we need to be calm and wait for the facts. Those are the exact words you actually gave on a TPT interview. We need to be calm and wait for the facts to clear the officers in the matter. So you clearly think that the facts will clear the officers, but you're giving us a side of the story that isn't that is skewing the narrative. That instead of saying, let's just wait for everything, you just gave me 20 seconds of here's what I think happened, even though you weren't there. This is where the frustration and the protests come from, Bob. Don't you agree?
Well, I think a lot of the frustration, the protests came from misinformation from so-called eyewitnesses at the scene also. So when that information is getting put out there, certainly the first information that was out there was he was in handcuffs when the police shot him, and he was shot in the back of the head and that kind of stuff. So I think it was important to dispel that to calm the community.
We're talking here with Bob Kroll, the head of the Minneapolis Police Union here, and we're talking here in the weeks after the shooting death of Jamar Clark, in North Minneapolis and the protests that followed there as well. Why is it hard, though? And your position is one by which your default is defend police officers. And I do wonder if that doesn't skew things, right? I mean, there will be officers, and we're not speaking to this specific case, but who do bad, who did the wrong thing. But there's this blind allegiance that people talk about by which we're going to defend an officer no matter what. Is that healthy?
I don't think we defend officers no matter what. There's been times where officers have been terminated and the Federation has not appealed or even grieved the circumstances, and they've gone away, and they've gone away quietly, and we didn't comment on it. So there are those cases. We don't blindly defend officers. We look at the facts available to us. There's nothing wrong with any police leader being a union boss or a chief to come out and say, we're backing our officers, and we believe that the investigation in the end will clear them, and we're asking for community calm. That's not a very strong statement when he gets into it's not digging down into the actual facts, but that's what needed to be done. It needed to be done early, and let's just let the facts come in, and hopefully the sooner the better. I would like to have this investigation wrapped up very soon. These officers are going through some very hard times right now, and everybody forgets about that. They didn't ask to be put in that situation. They just went to work that day, and I've been in contact with the officers. We have not discussed the incident, but I've been in every other day contact with them just to see how they're doing, because they're sitting on home assignment right now, and that affects their psyche also. And it leads, when you bring an outside investigation in, they brought in the BCA, that broke the norm of how we investigate things. The federal, the Department of Justice, the feds are in investigating. That gives the officers, not peaceful minds. They're worried about the outcome. They're worried about if this is a witch hunt against them.
So you don't agree with those moves?
No, I think for many years we've been able to investigate our own officer-involved shootings, and we've got a very clean department. There's integrity throughout the ranks, and we're perfectly capable of investigating our own. I don't think we need to break parity. And if you look at some other incidents, there was one where Al Flowers, it was a high-profile one, and because he was a community activist, he was entitled to a special investigation. They didn't do it through internal affairs. They didn't do it through the Office of Police Conduct Review or the prior civilian review. They brought in a special investigator to investigate these officers that had to deal with him, unfortunately, that night. And at the end of that investigation, it was cleared. So who gets special treatment and who doesn't? I think we need a standard, and we need to hold to that standard. Whether that's an outside investigator entirely, and we come to some terms and agreement, that's fine. or if we keep it inside. And I think as Chief McManus was the one that actually brought it back. It used to be Hennepin County investigating years ago. When we had Bill McManus, he said, no, we're a major city. We're going to do our own officer-involved shooting investigations, and we did that.
We're in a moment in this country where there's a lot of conversations about police and policing and race and the role that implicit bias and racism plays in policing. Your style is, to quote a profile of you that I saw, I think this is City Pages, maybe this is Star Tribune, I apologize, I didn't write this down, but your style is a hard-nosed approach to policing, and this is a quote in that story, which is a vestige of a bygone era. One critic says he represents a really culturally incompetent and racially hostile style of policing. Are you the proper spokesperson for police at this moment when some very sensitive conversations are being had?
Well, I think that's up to the officers that elect us to these positions. I've been on the board for nearly 20 years, 19 and a half. And, you know, the background involved here is you can't believe everything you read, for starts. And if you compare my history, you're going to find that I had a lot of citizen contacts. You're going to find that I made a lot of arrests. And when you operate that way, when you're a patrol officer, when you're a patrol sergeant, and you have more contacts, you're going to get more complaints. And that style of policing, you know, when diplomacy fails, you're going to need that style of policing. Not everybody's going to be compliant. And I'm a firm believer in law enforcement. You ask people nicely to do something. If you don't gain compliance, you order them harshly to do what you're telling them, so you don't have to use force. But when that fails, you have to use force. And I'm one of those cops that doesn't back down and will use force when necessary. I'm not going to turn around and walk away.
Complaints about your style, complaints about specific incidents against you, including lawsuits. One cited here in 95, accused of kicking, beating, and choking and using racial slurs against a 15-year-old boy. A federal grand jury cleared you. There was a drug raid in 96 that you oversaw, and then in the ensuing confusion, an officer was shot by one of his own. The city attorney in December recommended a big payment to settle a suit where you were accused of beating and kicking a suspect in an impound lot in February of 04. And this is a list of incidents, Bob, for which, frankly, the protesters say makes you unqualified to be at the point where we're having really important conversations about the role of race in policing.
Well, and I think you got to look at each incident and how they arrived there, how those situations, that lawsuit with the 15-year-old boy, as they say, that was one of the big high-end attorneys that's notorious for suing police, and he's who everybody goes to. We spent 6 weeks in federal court right here in downtown St. Paul under an African-American judge. And after that 6 weeks in trial, I spent a day and a half on the stand. I was completely cleared. They gave him zero. At that time, the city council considered giving that kid $160,000, and I talked him out of it because Denny Scholstad, the only conservative member of the city council at the time, approached me, and he said, should we fight this or not? And there was a 7-6 vote on the council. We took it to trial, and they gave him nothing. And that's that. We need more of that. So I was cleared of that.
And just as we talk about these, and I understand that for all these incidents that you know, I'm only saying this because I don't have time to go through each one of them, but I understand. I do understand that for each of these, you note that there's a longer story to talk about. The question I want to get to, though, is Chief Hartow is requiring everyone to go through implicit bias training. Have you done that training?
No, we've met with the people that are bringing it in.
Do you think, though, that if that's useful training in your opinion, I don't know if you think that, but that if you reflect on your career, if you reflect on these incidents, that you would have maybe handled those precise moments differently? Do you think that? Do you ponder that?
I'm looking forward to attending the training. We've met with, they've met with the Federation, the group that's administering it has met. We'll attend it. I wouldn't change any of my actions when you go through my history. Maybe other officers would have handled things differently, as we all do. There's different ways to handle calls. And maybe if I handled some of those dangerous situations differently, I wouldn't be here today. I mean, your complaints, again, I was on the SWAT team for 15 years, and that was one drug raid of 8 we had on tap that night. I've done approximately 1,500 high-risk entries And there was an armed guy inside there, and he pointed a shotgun at us. We shot him, and officers on the outer perimeter that I wasn't directly supervising shot into the house, and that's when one of my officers got hit. So to put that botched drug rate on me, what about the other roughly 1,499 that came out successful?
Do you think implicit bias, and I know you haven't done the training, but do you think in general that that's a concept you agree with, that we all come to the table with an implicit bias?
I think everybody in the world would have some type of biases in their head when they grow up, just because of the way they grow up or where they grow up, et cetera.
And as we look forward here, I mean, your role then in this debate, big picture, right? I mean, I understand you quibble and you really were not cool with some of the fact that the protesters were there, frankly, at the 4th Precinct. But big picture, take that step back, Bob. One of the things that the protesters were talking about is the police just have to change the way they do their job. There are things we have to change because too many black men are ending up dead at the hands of officers. Just, again, big picture, do you agree that there are reforms that could be and should be made?
I don't think that group should speak for change. That the groups that is out there now. Let's look back. The spokesperson for the NAACP also was on CNN Live with Brooke Baldwin, and she said the police, off-duty police, did the shooting of the 5 people out there. That's very irresponsible, and so I don't think we should be dictated by what that very small group of protesters thought. You know, we're talking about a couple hundred people out here, many of which didn't live in the city or even from here. What about the 380,000 other people in the city of Minneapolis that think the police are doing a fine job? And what is the qualifications for this group of protesters to know how to do police work better than the police that are out there doing it, all of which have a minimum of a 2-year degree in law enforcement, many of which have a 4-year degree, and they've been through weeks and weeks and months of scenario trainings. What is the training and experience? I wouldn't ever go to anyone else's job and tell them how to do it.
I would submit, Bob, that what they're saying, though, is that the only numbers we care to look at is and this is more nationally too with these debates, but here in Minneapolis too, that something's not working. You have an ACLU report that says black people in Minneapolis are 9 times more likely to be arrested for low-level offenses than white people. You have black men end up shot by police, and they're saying, look, I may not know the answer of how exactly to change the police department, but something has to change.
Well, let's look at those two things separately. First, the arrest. I've never seen anybody get arrested for not committing a crime. The simple solution to that is don't commit crime. The next one on shootings, let's look at shootings in the city of Minneapolis and how many black-on-black shootings have occurred. 80% of our 40-plus homicides this year are black suspects in custody. We heard all about when the white guys shot up the protesters that night, and they came out and said it was off-duty police. Well, no, it was within 21 hours. Sergeant Kelly O'Rourke had those shooters in custody, obtained confessions, and got them charged. What about downtown earlier this summer where on video there's a black male shooting 5 other black males, and Officer Steve Lisi goes up and takes him into custody right away? What about those things? And where's the difference? Where's the outcry? Where is the outcry on these other nearly 40 murders that have occurred? Where is Black Lives Matter on these issues? That's what we've got to ask ourselves. Police killing people is not the problem in Minneapolis. We've had over 250 shootings this year. Let's look at the statistics on who's pulling the trigger and who's getting hit.
You said that the protesters, in your opinion, don't live there, but the numbers suggest only about 6% of Minneapolis police officers live in Minneapolis. The officers don't live there either. Is that a problem?
I don't think it's a problem. We've gone over the years where they used to live there. Way back in the 70s, they found that the too many police and fire living in the city had too much political power, and they actually influenced the political process, and they were happy to let them go. And then in the mid-'90s, they reinstituted city residency, and we changed that at the state legislature. So that could be said for anyone. Why don't you live where you work?
Final thought here, Bob. Do you want to be active? And what I mean by that, do you want to be actively engaged, especially with the groups who we're at? the 4th Precinct, the NAACP and the Black Lives Matter? Do you want to sit down with them and say, let's work on this. Let's figure out some answers?
No, I don't think they speak for the community. I really don't. I think they have a driven agenda, and it's not in the best interest of the good citizens of Minneapolis. And I think that the media is catering to them, and I think that they're getting way too much attention. Again, we're talking about a few hundred people that have ill intent, and they're getting too much publicity, and they don't speak for the 380,000 plus people that live in the city of Minneapolis.
Bob Kroll is head of the police union. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.